Ignacio, Álverez, and Jorge.
Okay, so this paper was actually written for the 25th for Rogue issue on the anniversary of the Madrid paper. So it's basically revisiting the wage-led, growth-led theoretical framework in the context of finance. And so, well, I won't kind of belabor the point about the role of finance and the neoliberal period, but the focus over here is on two specific aspects of this period. One, the financialization of the corporation and the rise to dominance of shareholder value, and the growth of shareholder power. And the other is the growth of debt-led consumer demand. So these are two kind of important features of the post-90s period. Now, both these aspects of the period of financialization and the era of dominance of finance, in a way, accentuate inequality. There is the Post-Keynesian literature. I'm not kind of referring to it. There's a huge literature looking on the impact of this dominance of finance on investment and capacity utilization. What I am doing here is incorporating this into, incorporating these two features into a standard Post-Keynesian model. And in one with debt-led consumer demand, and the other with rising shareholder capital power, shareholder power. And in both these cases, we can distinguish a finance-led regime where the growth of finance stimulates demand, and a finance burden regime where the growth of finance depresses demand. Now, to the standard, the traditional Madrid model is in terms of the slope of the demand curve, but in structural models, you also bring in the distribution curve, which and it will capture the effect of finance and distribution in a particularly idiosyncratic way, which you will see. Okay. And so then we look at the interaction between demand and distribution. Standard kind of relationship between income and labor and capital. We have the tweak is we have a shareholder class which receives dividend income. We kind of basically postulate or assume that the growth of equity is proportional to capital stock. So that dividend earning is again can be that expression. D is equal to rho times A. Profits retained by the capitalist firm are the profits minus the dividend paid out. Okay, so that's the retained profit. So the thing is, this dividend payment on one hand kind of reduces savings and increases consumption, but on the other hand, it reduces investment. So it has this twin effect on investment in this model. So aggregate saving is basically workers consume their entire wages, capitalists save a fraction of their retained profits, shareholders save a fraction of their dividend earnings, and we have, it's not including funds to equity issues. And you have a savings function. We have investment function. Again, we use the form of the investment function in Madrid. So it is a function of the profit share and capacity utilization. The wrinkle is we now add in the term for the shareholder income, right? For shareholder power, and basically capturing the fact that the rise of shareholder power kind of pulls away income from investment towards the shareholder. It affects. There's this whole literature about how, with the rise to dominance of shareholder power, investment has suffered, right? To move. So that last term is capturing that. Okay. So the standard formulation of equilibrium. The only difference now is that we also have to include equity issues in. So investment is financed by savings plus new equity issues. That's the second term. and we get basically that equilibrium condition. Capacity utilization responds to excess demand, and we have a Keynesian stability condition. Of course, there's this whole debate about Harrodian versus Keynesian stability, but I'm going, because this is the Magdalen variation on the Magdalen-Thazi model, the Keynesian stability condition is satisfied. Simple comparative statics in terms of the dividend return on shareholdings. We find we can, in terms of dividend return, we have two regimes. The dominant or subordinate, or you can call it the shareholder burdened and the shareholder led regimes. In one, basically capacity utilization responds positively to the increase in shareholder power, and in the other, it responds negatively. Now, this basically has an implication for the relationship between U and pi. So pi now is all non-wage income. It's not just profits, it's also dividend income. So is that we basically kind of include, basically argue that the shareholder power, the ability of the shareholder to extract greater income rises with inequality, right? So with growing inequality, shareholders are the shareholder power becomes stronger. It is able to, so that rho is a positive function of pi. So when you add that, the first part of the du by dt pi is your standard Magdalen-Thazi kind of factorization of wage-led, profit-led. The second part comes because we have also now made rho a function of pi. So you have a second part, and this depends on whether it is a finance-led or finance-burdened, dominant finance or subordinate finance regime. And basically, the stagnationist tendency will prevail where shareholders are dominant, and an exhilarationist tendency or a profit-led tendency will prevail where shareholders are subordinate. So that is the two regimes, the shareholder-led and shareholder. So you have these two regimes based on whether it is finance-led or finance-burdened. Now turning to consumer credit. Again, the consumer debt allows workers to increase their consumption, but it's also a mechanism which transfers income from the worker to the capitalist. It's again another form of financial expropriation of the worker. So consumer credit is proportional to savings. So in that sense, it's there's no. We don't have a consumption a credit constraint. It is proportional to savings. And nor do we have any kind of thing where consumption is targeting a particular consumption level. So we have a very simple formulation. So workers' consumption now is out of income, but then you have to kind of subtract the income, the interest payments, and then the new debt. Okay. And again, gamma is consumer credit normalized by capital. So now gamma is now our critical variable. So aggregate savings normalized by capital. We have our savings function. We have our investment function. I include an interest term in the investment function. It's not necessary, but just that's one formulation of the investment function where it is which includes the impact of interest payment. Equilibrium. Again, standard, again, capacity utilization response to excess demand, and you have the Keynesian stability condition. But here again, and this is the key, you have, if we take gamma, we take the scale of credit, we can again distinguish between a debt-led and a debt-burdened regime. You can see there's there are conditions under which a rise in gamma is going to increase capacity utilization, and there are conditions under which it's going to reduce capacity utilization. So we have two regimes. And now bringing in the non-wage share or the surplus share. Again, the wrinkle here is that now credit itself depends on this measure of inequality pi. Because as inequality increases, as workers' incomes are suppressed relative to other incomes, their recourse to credit is going to increase. So that makes, so we bring that, and that again complicates the term, the standard term, the criteria for wage-led and profit-led in terms of the slope of this demand curve. So that now, so the second part of this of the term, the alpha minus 1 minus gamma is pi, etc. That is your standard Magdalen-Bartley formulation. But now, because we have included gamma as a function of pi, we also have the first part, which again, its sign depends on whether the regime is debt-led or debt-burdened. So an accelerationist tendency will dominate in a debt-led, and a stagnationist in a debt-burdened. So we now have two models, shareholder and debt, a shareholder model and a consumer debt-led model. We can do the demand isocline for both these models. And both these models lend themselves to this typology of classification of finance-led and finance-burdened. The finance-led regime tends to be profit-led, the finance-burdened tends to be wage-led. The demand null clients will be upward sloping in the profit-led finance-led regime and downward sloping in a wage-led finance-burdened regime. So now let's bring in the distribution isocline. And I'm glad Michalis walked right into this moment. So again, the inequality will rise more quickly as capacity utilization rises. So this, I have a linear specification for the distribution alkaline, but there's evidence, right, Michalis, to believe that it's non-linear, the distribution in alkaline. But what I'm going, and there may be debate on this because in a lot of empirical characterization, the US is seen as basically a profit squeeze. But what I'm arguing is that with finance, one, inequality will rise more quickly as capacity utilization rises, but inequality will also increase as shareholder power or the scale of consumer debt increases. The more consumer, credit is created, the more you siphon off money from workers, the more inequality can be created. So we have basically an upward sloping distribution null-cline in the profit share capacity utilization. So now let's look at the effect of a redistribution to workers. So so if we have to characterize wage-led, profit-led, there has to be something which is kind of shifting, kind of changing the wage share or the profit share, and that happens with the shift to the distribution curve. And we see that in both cases, whether it's profit-led or wage-led, the redistribution to worker, because of the shape of the distribution isocline, tends to increase capacity utilization. So in a finance-led regime, even if demand is profit-led, redistribution to workers tends to result in a higher level of capacity utilization. In a finance-burdened regime, the overall impact of redistribution would raise capacity utilization. Now, in a finance-burdened case, you have within certain specific parameters stability. In the other case, it is saddle-path dynamics. So, in a way, dominance of finance is associated with wage-led tendencies in the sense that redistribution away from workers leads to a decrease in capacity utilization, even if demand is profit-led. So that is the first kind of takeaway. The second is, again, we have to kind of think of what shifts, this whole wage-led, profit-led characterization is confounded, but there will be factors which shift both the distribution curve and the demand curve. And disentangling those effects becomes really difficult empirically. So now we can say, let's say financial deregulation strengthens the dominance of finance. It could lift and it could lead to a shift of the distribution curve away from workers. If it promotes shareholder power or the scale of consumer debt, the demand curve would also shift. And the shift in the demand curve would depend on whether the regime is finance-led or finance-burdened. So in either case, deregulation shifts the distribution isocline to the right. But in one case, the demand isocline shifts to the left, finance-burdened, and to the right in finance-led. Again, in both cases, the effect of the increasing of deregulation, which shifts both these curves, leads to a decrease in capacity utilization. So, exogenous shocks, so basically exogenous shocks that shift both demand and distribution climate, confound your traditional characterized causal relationship between distribution and demand. But they also kind of confound a simple way of thinking of wage-led and profit-led, because even if demand, we're showing that you have, in both, financial deregulation has basically exacerbated stagnationist tendencies, right? So we basically investigate two implications of, of these two characteristics of financializations, dominance of shareholder value, in a very simple model, and credit-driven demand. And we argue that inequality dynamics will tend to exacerbate wage-led tendencies. Again, this depends critically on the upward sloping distribution curve line, which is not how generally the US is characterized, but that's the key to the dynamic. The financial deregulation strengthens dominance of finance, leads to a reduction in capacity utilization with a shift in distribution towards surplus owners. So if this leads to both increasing inequality and to a shift in demand, even in finance-led and finance-burdened cases, you would have a stagnationist tendency. And so I think this insight is important for the contemporary US economy, especially now that recovery is continues to be constrained by inequality and stagnant demand, despite the recent increase in wages. And these twin constraints cannot be addressed without confronting the dominance of finance in this regime. But that is what characterizes both the shape of the distribution curve and the shifts in the demand outline. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm going to present a paper that we've done with my colleague Gökçer Özgür on the fragilities of the Turkish economy. The main the paper is available, so you can read it. There's a lot of stuff in there. But I'm just going to give you the main ideas and the main arguments in the paper. When you look at the Turkish economy, especially since the 2001 crisis, up until very recently, what you see is a strong economic growth at some points, approaching almost 10%, above 6% sometimes, which created this view that the Turkish economy is doing very well, it's very strong, and this is basically due to the structural reforms that were done at the beginning of the 2000s. And that's if you read some World Bank reports showing Turkey as an exemplary case, you read some, pieces that say, this is all the other emerging and developing economies should follow and those kind of things. That's what got us started thinking about this to see what is actually going on. And what we show basically in this paper is that, one, the traditional risk of a capital flow reversal is still valid for the economy. But more important than that, what the economy now has is new forms of external vulnerabilities that have recently emerged in the 2000s. And the third point is basically these vulnerabilities are not limited to external vulnerabilities, but domestic vulnerabilities, domestic fragilities have developed over time as well. So what we find basically is that these, the increase in these types of vulnerabilities have made it fundamentally more difficult to figure out the potential risks in the economy and the outcomes that might actually follow them. Just to give you, this is what you all know, but this is the basis of all the reforms that were done. A lot of developing countries had financial crises since early 1980s, mostly related with capitalist flow reversals and those kind of things, and you have, as a result, 3 generations of crisis models which, you know, the first generation was basically built on the idea that the developing economies have these crises because they have weak fundamentals, whatever that means. The second generation was basically focused on the fixed exchange rate regimes because that was seen as the main sort of like issue. And the third generation, whatever sort of like emerged after the 97 Asian financial crisis, talked about the accumulation of external debt, the dollarization of the liabilities, and insufficient foreign exchange. And you know, you have all sorts of like mistaken policies, information asymmetries, and those kind of things in that. But what came out of this approach was a bunch of sort of policy conclusions that stressed that if you want to avoid financial crisis, you want to avoid financial fragility, you have to have strong domestic economic fundamentals, which usually involve decreasing government debt, decreasing the borrowing requirements, strengthening the financial sector. So there's a whole bunch of reforms that go to the banking sector, not using fixed exchange rate regimes, having sort of like floating, flexible exchange rate regimes, and also increasing the level of foreign exchange reserve accumulation, sort of like as a precautionary thing. Now, what happened in Turkey was basically, you know, after the 2001 financial crisis, a series of structural reforms were introduced, mostly based on these ideas, right? So the government budget deficits were brought under control by sort of like paying off most of the debt through privatizations and then sort of like cutting a lot of things. So you have primary budget surplus and those kind of things. There's a huge banking reform, a move towards flexible exchange rates, central bank independence introduced, and then after that we have a switch to inflation targeting. So basically most of the orthodox structural reform propositions were implemented. So what do you have as a result? So what this thing shows at the top, this is the 2001 crisis, and now you have real GDP growth above 6%, reaching to 10% at some point almost. This is the global financial crisis, so that's when you have the, and then this is that. What you see in the economy, of course, is the other line that sort of is the complete opposite of it, which shows you the current account deficit. So what you have is if the economy is growing, it has current account deficits, okay? And at times of crisis, that turns into a current. This graph starts in 2000, but if you take it all the way back to 1989, which is the first year of financial account liberalization, you see the same thing. Growth comes with current account deficits. And then, you know, when you have a crisis, you have a current account surplus. Except in this crisis, you still have the sort of like reverse relationship, but we do not have a current account surplus, so the deficit remained lower. And then after this, if you look at it after 2009, the current account deficit just keeps getting larger and larger as well. Okay, you have the opposite relationship. The bars are essentially showing the capital inflows. The yellow ones are the short-term capital inflows, and the gray ones are FDI. So you also see, you know, you have the current account deficit, you have capital inflows, and you have economic growth. Capital flows disappear. Excuse me, what are the colors? This one is the short-term inflows, sure, and this one is the FDI. Okay. So basically, you have a huge inflow after the quantitative easing. You have a huge inflow of short-term capital flows into the economy as well. What does this do? So that's sort of like the question. So the first idea that comes to your mind, of course, is that growth is very much dependent on that. Together with this, if you look at the external debt situation of the economy, what you basically see is that there was, you know, the government external debt is around 24, 28% after the crisis, goes all the way down to 14%. So a very significant decrease in the external debt accumulation of the government, which did not actually decrease the external debt of the whole economy, because now you have the private sector, mostly the banking sector and the non-financial corporations, now borrowing from outside. And this gets pretty serious after the 2008-2009 crisis, after the quantitative easing, essentially, as it becomes extremely cheap to borrow from outside. So, together with this is the non-financial corporations. So we're not talking about the banking sector. The banks always borrow from outside and those kind of things. But this is non-financial corporations. And there's two things. This one is showing the net foreign exchange position of them. after 2008, there's a significant decline. Not only that, but also the banks borrowing from outside in foreign currency started lending in foreign currency as well. So non-financial corporations began borrowing in foreign currency from domestic banks.
Well, not through bond issues. Not bond issues.
No, directly borrowing from the banks. So they're doing two things at the same time. The large ones especially are borrowing from outside directly through bond issues and those kind of things. And a bunch of them are borrowing indirectly from outside through the banking system, which sort of like creates a more complicated picture than the previous eras. So that's sort of like one of the things, one of the new sort of like external vulnerabilities that we're talking about. This is the international investment position for the whole economy. So you see the significant decline after 2008, 2009. It is a little bit of a recovery. But now, the international investment position is about 55% of the whole GDP. So that's like more than half of the GDP essentially, which is also a new situation. This hasn't happened in most of the economies, most of the old economies before crisis. Then there's the issue of reserves. A lot of people, including the IMF, praised the Turkish central bank and in terms of like accumulating enough foreign exchange reserves. So there's always talk about there's a lot of external debt, but that's not important because the external the foreign exchange reserves are quite high. In fact, if you look at the published external reserve numbers, this one is showing the amount of reserves in relation to total short-term debt of the economy. So it's most of the time it's about 100%. More recently, it started going down after sort of all this, starting around like the tapering announcement of the Fed and those kind of things. But there's a trick here too, which is one of the things that the central bank did was it told the banks that they can hold part of their reserves, the required reserve ratio, they can hold part of them in foreign currency. Which meant that in this, if you look at the central bank balance sheet, in the foreign exchange reserves, you actually also have the bank's foreign exchange held by the central bank. So if you take that out, because that actually belongs to the banking system, the situation is actually pretty dire in terms of the ability to cover the short-term debt. The short-term debt reserves are only about like 30% of the short-term debt. So that's sort of like there's that kind of trick going on as well. Now that's the external part of it. What is also interesting and new in the context of the Turkish economy is the domestic part of it. The bars are showing you the total bank credit to the private sector as a percentage of GDP. Okay? So start around the crisis, total credit to the economy is around less than 10%, 7-8% or something like that. And then you see this significant climb in that. By the time that you reach this year, I guess it's above 65%. If you look at 65%, total debt in the economy, total credit to the economy, 65%, that doesn't look that high, of course, in terms of if you compare it to the US or whatever. But what you need to look at is the sort of dynamic here in which that actually has increased, which has been one of the main factors essentially behind the strong economic growth as well. The pink line that I put over there is showing you the real interest rate. So that's sort of like, the real interest rate is quite high during the crisis, but after that, a significant decline, and after the quantitative easing, you have it basically zero. So,
does this include the foreign the loans in foreign currency?
This is, yes, well, if the bank lends to the private sector, yes, yeah, all of it. To the domestic sector, yeah. So this is by sector, who borrows? Okay, we got rid of the government debt, we decreased the government borrowing requirement. This is, you see the significant decrease coming like this. But then it is also happening at the same time. But if you think about it, this doesn't make any sense anyway either. You can't have high economic growth while you're cutting down the government debt, unless some other debt in the economy is that's sort of like, that's pretty straightforward. We worked that out in the paper as well. So you have the, this is the non-financial corporations debt as a percentage of GDP. This is the household debt, which is also a new thing. If you look at the previous periods after the crisis, you don't really have household debt at all. this sort of like starts here and then takes up. This is also like around this time mortgages were introduced in the economy as well, like 10-year mortgages, which didn't exist before. So with that, now domestically, you manage to control the government borrowing requirements and then open the gates for the corporations and the households to borrow, you know, as much as they can, essentially. That's sort of like one of the things going on there. This is just to show you, give you an idea. This is basically the private sector's debt service ratio, which you can see has been increasing after 2010 as well. The ratios are important, but also you have to look at the sort of like dynamics here, the sort of tendencies here as well. And again, to just give you an idea, this is the banking sector's total credit as a percentage of their deposits. Okay, so we're talking about, you can call some sort of financial deepening, essentially, measure, but basically their lending has increased significantly. So you have two sort of like periods. This is after the crisis, and this is after the quantitative easing policies that started in the world. So, what do these pictures basically tell you? These pictures tell you three things, in my opinion. The first one is that although the economy has grown and all that kind of stuff, what you now have is a situation where a potential negative shock is more difficult to contain. Because in the previous crisis, in most of the developing economies, the shock affected the government or the banking sector. So the government couldn't face that, you make a deal with the IMF, you contain the situation. The banks can't pay their debt, the government takes them over, contains the situation. But now it's a little bit more than that, because you have the non-financial corporations increase their borrowing significantly domestically as well as from outside. So add the currency risk to there. You have the households, that's sort of like. The second thing is that given this nature domestically of finance-led nature of the economic growth, you don't really need a shock either. Just a slowdown in credit growth is very much likely to lead to certain problems in the economy. And then when you combine these two, the external vulnerabilities and domestic vulnerabilities, then what happens is that the existing models that we have are not sufficient to sort of like figure out what the potential chain reactions to a shock or to a slowdown in credit is likely to be. So that's basically sort of the gist of the argument in the papers. We can talk about the details if you have questions at the end. Thank you.
Well, we're going to be presenting Jorge from the University of Castilla-La Mancha and me with a fine-tuned title with respect to what is in the program, something of the case of Spain as a wage-led economy, but as a wage-led economy in a context of internal devaluation. So what we want to do is to use the Vaduri-Margil model to see if Spain is a wage-led or profit-led economy, but in order to assess, in order to evaluate the actual internal devaluation policy that is followed at this moment in Spain. So, as you know, the internal devaluation or wage devaluation has been pushed, at this moment it is applied in Europe or within the Eurozone, supposedly for two reasons. First reason is to correct external imbalances, since we are no longer countries with the capacity to go for a currency devaluation. The only way, we'll say the orthodoxy, is in order to regain price competitiveness is to go for a wage devaluation, for internal devaluation. The only way to adjust for external imbalances after the crisis. Besides, there is a second reason that is basically said all the time by the European Commission, that is to boost economic growth. The internal devaluation policy should trigger an export-led recovery in the context where domestic demand is basically, we have a shortfall in domestic demand due to the fiscal austerity policy. So these are the two reasons proposed by the European Commission to develop this strategy. our objective or research objective is to look at this wage devaluation policy, but in the context of a wage-led economy. I mean, we want to assess to what extent this policy has been useful to boost economic growth in Spain to overcome the crisis. And therefore, the theoretical approach is basically the plurimarket model and all the post-Keynesian literature. But we use this model to assess if this policy is correct policy in terms of triggering the ability to trigger an export-led strategy or not. So we organize the research basically 3 points. After this first one, the second one is what is internal devaluation. I mean, we are basically very familiar people from within the Eurozone with internal devaluation. Probably some of you are not, so I will explain this quickly. Is Spain a wage-led or a profit-led economy? We have to test this. And finally, what are the policy implications and the effects of internal devaluation on economic growth? So first of all, what is internal devaluation? What does wage devaluation mean in terms of the economic policy that is at this moment pursued in the Eurozone, especially on peripheral countries, Greece, Portugal, Italy not that much, but also and Spain too, is the attempt to get external adjustment, both external adjustment and economic recovery, by decreasing the nominal wage growth and then decreasing the unit labor cost, so that the relative inflation of Spain is able to regain price competitiveness according to the neighborhood countries. So that's the reason that explains labor market reforms in Spain in 2010, 11, and especially in 2012. Labor market reforms that they have tried to tackle basically the collective bargaining framework and the dismissal codes and procedures of hiring and firing. So we have these three, and especially the last one, strong labor market reforms that basically change and erode the collective bargaining framework in Spain. And we have to see if these steps have been accomplished or not. This is the first thing to do. So we see that step one has been fulfilled. I mean, we have registered, the Spanish economy has registered a sharp contraction in unit labor costs during the last years, and especially after 2000, after the crisis, but after the three labor reforms that I've been talking about. So we do have this sharp contraction in nominal unit labor cost. So you can see that the nominal unit labor cost has tended to adjust to the European average, Eurozone average. The second step has only partially fulfilled. The reduction in unit labor cost has not completely been translated into a lower inflation. I mean, we have that the reduction in unit labor cost here has not been completely translated into the black line, the inflation, since we have that it's been basically used by corporations to increase profits in a context of the leveraging of these corporations. So this second step has only partially fulfilled, and the third step it has only partially fulfilled too. I mean, when we see the impact in this third step, the impact of all these in terms of external competitiveness, what we see is that when we measure external competitiveness in terms of real effective exchange rates measured as export prices compared to the real effective exchange rate measured as unit labor cost, we see that the decrease in the effective exchange rate measured by unit labor cost has not been completely transferred to the exchange rate measured as export prices. So, okay, we have internal devaluation, we have wage devaluation, only partially fulfilled according to the orthodoxy. But anyway, this had in Spain consequences in terms of functional distribution. So since the decrease in inflation is been lower than the decrease in wages, we have basically the adjusted wage share continue with the tendency of decrease, with the decline tendency, and that means that, and we go to the second point, that we can ask ourselves if this is useful in terms of triggering an export-led recovery and triggering GDP recovery. Since you know, and I will go fast on this because it's already known, that economy can be wage-led or profit-led in terms of you can see here, is better in terms of Vasudevan model. This model attempts to capture the dual narrative, the dual nature of wages. Wages are costs for companies, but wages are also internal demand for the economy. So the final effect on the aggregate demand of a change in the wage share, it will depend. It will depend basically on the elasticity of exports, investments, and consumption on the impact of all these elasticities on the final demand. So we test the Vasudevan model. In fact, at the beginning we test the basic Vasudevan model for the Spanish economy with annual data, and we end up introducing, basically because of the reasons that Ramaa said, expanding the Vasudevan model to test also equations for debt, for household debt and for corporate debt, since Spain, as you know, has been a great example of debt-driven economy and debt-driven growth, at least the decade before the crisis. So the equations that we use is for this paper. We don't use anymore annual data because we want to test the internal devaluation policy. That means that we need a lot of data. We use quarterly data for the period of the decade before the crisis and the years after the crisis, and we extend the Vasudevan model to introduce the debt into the model. Because if we don't do that, we basically may have a biased results on the coefficients of consumption and debt. And investment. For consumption, we use an equation that includes wages, profits, and also household debt and the stock of debt. I mean, we use two variables to capture debt and the influence of debt. Basically, the change in household debt, but also the stock, the level of debt. Because what we find in the literature is that the effect of the change in the credit that gets the households and the level of the stock, they might have opposite signs, and that's basically what we get. As you suggest, you have the opposite signs of the change in the consumption. In the credit received by households and the stock of the total amount of household debt. And the investment function, it depends on the rent, on the accelerator of the rent, on the profit share, but also it includes three variables testing for debt: household debt, corporate debt, and the stock of household debt. And you will ask, why household debt? Well, basically because in Spain the investment is being driven on a 75% at least by the residential bubble, by the building, the real estate bubble. So if we, as we will see, if we will only take into account corporate debt, we'll probably not capture the effect of debt on investment. And then the equations on domestic and export prices, export function and import function, and the normal equations basically used on Vasudevan and Marley in different tests on the Post-Keynesian literature. Estimation strategy is basically very similar to the one used on the literature. We don't use simultaneous equations models, since we prefer to use coefficients in order to interpret as marginal elasticities the final results. All variables are expressed as first different logarithms, and we introduce autoregressive terms for all the equations, since we test autocorrelation to its effect on the models. And we use the AMECO and Eurostat for annual and quarterly data, but here I will only show the quarterly data results. The annual data results are basically the same, so there is no difference between these. And what we find is basically what was supposed to be expected. And when we introduce the debt variables in terms of household debt, in terms of the stock of total debt, we continue to have more or less the same results, although the size of the coefficients change a little bit. We have, as you can see, well, here it's a little bit difficult to see, but I will go. We have these results for the total period, and for the period that we want to test, that is the period of the internal devaluation policy after 2010, and the results are basically the expected in literature. Coefficients of benefits on wages are positive and significant. The elasticity of consumption with respect to wages, credit, and on benefits. We have a positive relationship between income, expected demand, and investment, and we have also this, and the relationship between profitability and investment is positive too, but it's not that clear. But here we can see that how household debt is very determinant both on consumption and on investment. I mean, even more important than the effect of profitability on investment. And the third issue regarding to the size of coefficients is that unit labor costs are significant in explaining the evolution of prices. However, the relationship between unit labor costs and export prices is not so significant. That is something that we already saw with the data before. I mean, the internal devaluation policy has not been fully transformed into an export-led strategy, since these steps are not completely fulfilled in the causal relationship in between unit labor costs and external competitiveness. So when we try to see on third point, when we try to see what's the effects of the size of these coefficients on economic growth, and we go through I will not go through this because it's already known, is the calculations of the marginal propensities, but when we see the total effect of a change in 1% on the wage share, on consumption, on investment, and on net exports, what we basically see is that if we don't take into account, if we take into account the whole period from 1995 till today, we have a wage-led economy. But if we only take into account the period of the internal devaluation policy, the period after the crisis, this wage share nature of the Spanish economy, it becomes even greater. So we have in front of us a wage-led economy. The wage character of the economy is reinforced during the crisis and after the crisis, and it fits well with some of the things that you were proposing on a finance-led economy. Once you get a very high level of stock of household debt, internal devaluation, it probably is not able to trigger an export-led strategy, but it is negative to economic growth, and that's basically the idea. Wage devaluation has not a positive impact on GDP, but a negative impact. So, besides these three results, the Spanish economy is a wage-led economy. The wage-led character gets reinforced after the crisis. That basically has to do with the partial disconnection between profits and investment during this period. I mean, during this period, we don't see a clear connection in between profits and investment, besides the measures that are taken in that direction for the economic policy. So we don't end up to see this export-led strategy pushed and pursued by the European Commission and the Spanish government. So, to end up with the presentation, someone could say, okay, but then how come can you explain in Spain that you have in fact adjusted the external sector? As we can see here, after the crisis, we are able to adjust the external sector, and also that you are growing at this moment at a 3% annual every year. Well, this does not have to do with an export-led strategy, as you can see here, but it's basically domestic demand that is driving economic growth at this moment. Although the wage devaluation policy, we basically have, and we will not get into this, but we basically have the quantitative easing policy, the evolution of oil prices that especially affect the Spanish economy, and one important thing that is when you see the contribution of the different components of the domestic demand to GDP in Spain, what you basically can see is that after 2014 and especially in 2015, that it was, as you know, an electoral year for the Spanish economy. What we have is that we experience a break in fiscal austerity that has been able to explain to a certain degree, to an important degree, the economic recovery. So Spain is not that miracle of an export-led strategy being successful because of the application of a wage-led, of a wage devaluation policy, but is all the opposite. It's an economy that is at this moment growing, although the wage-led strategy, and because basically the measures that relate with the monetary policy and with the fiscal traditional policy, as we could expect on the post-Keynesian literature before even confronted with the real data. Thank you very much.
I think we have a moderator, but if you have
I can help moderate. This is the last part of the presentation. Yeah, if there are any questions?
One question for Ignacio. I wonder why the export prices are the correlation with the unit labor cost is too weak. So my question is why or how you are measuring the unit labor cost, because I made a paper where I can see a strong relationship between export prices and unit labor cost. So my question is how you are measuring the unit labor costs for Spain. And the second question is for the first presentation and yours, is you have a paper about your presentations. You and the first
Ramaa.
yeah, the first presentation. Yeah, you have a paper on your presentation. You have a paper.
Yeah.
We're on the way of writing a paper. we will have it in several weeks, I think. We're measuring unit labor cost as nominal labor cost as defined on the AMECO database, and real unit labor cost. I mean, in fact, here what you have is that when you use annual data, for example, here with annual data for the whole period, 1960 till today, you have that on export prices, the effect of unit labor cost on prices is much stronger. But during the period that we are studying at this moment, the different steps that takes you from the evolution of unit labor cost to export prices, you have to accomplish all the steps, and not all of them are accomplished. Basically, and the main reason at this moment in Spain is that although you have a decline in unit labor cost, this decline is not transferring to prices, international prices, not even to export prices, but international prices, and because they are captured by profits in a context where corporations they basically deleveraging from a very high level of debt.
Yeah, well, yeah, but also I want to mention that the unit labor cost is measured the real wages divided by productivity, right?
Nominal wage.
It's not the real?
In this case, it's nominal labor cost, it's nominal wages.
No, but it's always nominal wage
Yes.
over productivity.
This series is obtained almost directly from the AMECO series, the official AMECO national account series, and the real effective exchange rate based on unit labor cost is directly from the European Commission.
Yeah, but we're using nominal unit labor cost. In fact, when you use the real labor cost, what you have to wait is the wage share.
The wage share.
Yeah, real unit labor cost is
Yeah.
definitely.
I mean,
the wage
it's,
share.
the point is that unit labor cost is supposed to be the indicator used by orthodoxy and the European Commission to measure external competitiveness. But what we're basically saying is external competitiveness is much more complex than price competitiveness, and than price competitiveness measured only by unit labor cost. And in fact, what we have is, unit labor cost is not even able to change price competitiveness during this period in Spain, taking only into account price competitiveness. That in fact you have to take all the measures of external competitiveness into account to realize what is the external insertion of an economy. But even to take into account only price competitiveness, we don't see no complete transformation of the evolution of wages into external prices at this moment. When you take the long series in between the last 50 years, you see a more clear relationship, but not for these years.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Özgür and a question for Spain. So, does it matter that the foreign reserves are held by the central bank and the private banks? Like, why is it so important that a big chunk of the foreign reserves are held by the private banks? In theory, they can also mobilize the private banks' reserves to, let's say, deal with salary stock rates. About Ignacio, one question and one comment. So, have you run these regressions for the period also before the crisis, like stopping in 2010?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what does this give you? And related to these prices, unit labor costs and so on, with my experience in Greece, like we work a lot on this issue, it's also very useful to check the sectoral composition of prices, and like you can tell a more convincing story about how the price didn't really respond to this huge drop in unit labor costs.
Well, in terms of foreign exchange reserve, one thing that's important, I could be holding dollars at home as well, right, as a private person, and then, when the economy, needs them, I could be, using them, and, sort of whatever. But the point here is that the central bank does not have what it said it has, right? The banks can actually use it in some other time. They can actually withdraw it. They can put Turkish liras instead of US dollars as reserves. So the policymaker, the one who's going to make the interventions, does not actually have that. That's sort of like the important point. Even, like in terms of, when you look at the ratios to short term, that they can't sort of like, if the short term that was to leave, even that small amount was to leave the economy, they don't have enough to intervene, essentially. That's sort of like the point. Yeah, I can have it as a private individual, accumulation of reserves at home, and but that's a different thing. That's sort of like,
but it's a different, the individual and the banks, right? Because if a bank faces like a liquidity shortage in foreign,
exactly, the bank might use it, then the central bank won't have it. That's exactly. That's the point. Yeah. That is, the central bank can't help the banks with its own reserves, right? The bank is holding it at the central bank. Okay, the bank could have been holding it in its own private vault as well. The bank is definitely going to use it when it has currency problem, liquidity problem, whatever, but won't get help from the central bank because the central bank doesn't have anything. That's kind of like the point.
I think you have one more question to answer.
We have this what you asked. In fact, here you have the results for the period before the crisis with annual data for the baseline model for the simplified model without debt. Basically, you have standard results for on the consumption and investment equations. Also on the rest of the equations, you have a wage-led economy. The typical wage-led results for the Spanish economy before the crisis. Although we found out something that it was pretty interesting for the period only in between 1996 and 2006, 2007, the decade before the crisis. that if you use the baseline model, I mean the model, the simple public market model for the Spanish economy, and you don't introduce the variables, basically the household debt, what you get is an economy that is not even profit-led or wage-led. Weird economy, and it has to do with yeah, it has to do basically. Our interpretation is that it has to do with an economy that is at this moment very debt driven, and you're not introducing debt into the models. So you're not introducing the. I mean, debt is fundamental to understand investment and consumption in the Spanish economy during the 10 years before the crisis. So, and here I will have just one question for Ramaa. I don't know if it fits or not with your research, but do you think it is important to take into account not only the stock but also the annual changes on debt? I mean, is it consistent to find different signs, a positive sign on the change of debt and a negative sign on the stock debt? Because I thought it was consistent with your research.
So, I'm not sure actually. I have to think a little more. I mean, the thing about I mean, at least in the consumption model, the flow enters into consumption, right? And the thing about stock is going to be important in terms of repayment, right? So that would be so it basically, I think, would depend one on the sustainability of debt, basically interest rate and the stock. I think that would be the critical factor on whether the sign is I mean, the signs are the same or different. Okay. On whether the debt is because one thing which I didn't talk about was the sustainability of that debt, and that depends on the stock flow ratio. Mm-hmm. And I think that might explain. I mean, would be the difference in science.
Did you have a question as well?
Yeah, a question for you. So, I mean, this whole thing about the vulnerability of the non-financial sector, I think is a really important point. You see it in India, you see it in a lot of emerging economies now, and I mean, I've been trying to think about this, and in terms of what it means and how its implications are different from, let's say, vulnerability to the banking sector or sovereign debt, foreign currency debt, because it seems to me we need a fourth generation theory of crisis, right? Given that the new vulnerabilities and emerging
They usually come after the crisis, so
yeah, we have to wait. So maybe we should try and preempt it.
No, but I mean
because I think this is the key, and you know, in most emerging economies. And so I mean, have you thought about? I mean, what are the implications of this? Which I mean, how will it differ?
One of the things is that we should definitely do some sort of like a comparative study, because I've looked at a bunch of. It looks like this is very common.
It's exactly the way it's in India.
India,
right?
Mexico,
yeah.
whatever, a whole bunch of economies.
Yeah.
But not everything is so. You have the current account surplus and current account deficit
Yeah.
countries. So sort of like if you have oil or some sort of there's that difference. But that's very common. One of the things is that the scale. I mean, a couple of things. One is, as I said, it's a lot more difficult to contain it, because what the banking sector, you sort of like, you have experience, you know it, you have 5 banks and whatever, and here you have a whole bunch of corporations. Second, they take place in some sort of a, payment chain themselves, right? So where are they and what is going to break down is like a lot more difficult to see in this case. And it has sort of like, if one large corporation fails to meet its payment obligations, either to the outside world or to the domestic bank, what happens next? I mean,
what are the spillovers?
Exactly, so it's
like the banking system is quite clear what the spillovers are.
Exactly. And frankly, we haven't made a detailed study of that. This is sort of like what we're saying is that this is a new phenomena, and so, but it doesn't exist in any of the models. It doesn't exist in the previous crises.
Exactly.
So this is sort of like this is the new thing. I mean, I think you should make a model of this and
Is there securitization of this debt?
Not a lot, very small amounts, very small amounts. So, very valid question. I don't have an answer.
So neither do I, but I was hoping.
All right, any other questions? We have time for one or two more. If there are.
I have a question for the gentleman about Spain. Could you go to the slide that shows the uptick in growth here?
Which one? Sorry. Which slide?
The slide that has the graph that shows at the end growth in the economy. There.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Do you include the participation in the financial sector in that growth, or what all contributes to that? Because if you're devaluing wages and you're expanding credit, then it looks to me like the financial sector is going to grow. Either that or the state is going to have to intervene to make up for the situation with consumer participation in the economy. So, what all's included in that growth uptick there?
It's everything included. I mean, it's
You want the next slide?
GDP annual growth at this moment in Spain. I mean, we have, of course.
So it's GDP stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, so it includes the financial sector.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, and so, but is the financial sector contributing anything to real production in the economy?
But I mean, the point that you have here is the financial sector in the Spanish economy, the credit boom. The credit boom basically stops here. Credit boom stops here in the Spanish economy, and after that, what you have is that the process of deleveraging both of households and corporations in the Spanish economy that is taking very long, especially for households more than for corporations, and that, of course, here the GDP growth it is. I mean, here it includes financial sector, of course, but although it includes financial sector, this GDP growth here is not debt driven. I mean, the credit and the credit that is at this moment going into households and into corporations is very, very low in Spain. It's basically internal demand economic growth, and it's basically driven by an expansionary fiscal policy and the recovery of consumption of households and the evolution of oil prices and monetary policy at this moment within the Eurozone.
If you look at the national account data, the GDP of Spain, the value added broken down by industry, the financial sector is the only one that's still not growing in value added after all. So also all the other sectors are growing now, except for even construction is growing, but the financial sector is still not growing. So it's not led by profits in the financial sector.
I mean, the Spanish miracle at this moment is used as an example of an export-led successful strategy, and it is not. I mean, it is the result of traditional fiscal policy. An external.
But the current account is still doing better. No?
Yeah.
So even managing to keep the current account flat in the face of a 3.5% growth rate, at the same time when the rest of the Eurozone is growing at 0 or -1, other countries, this is an important export. Export-led performance. This is a very good.
No, it's more of collapsing internal demand than growth in exports.
There are two reasons why the flat part of the current account during the last year is not exactly the result of export-led growth or something like that. First of all, you have to take into account that the oil prices have been decreasing sharply, and it's very important for the Spanish current account. And secondly, nowadays imports in real terms are growing more or less the same than in in the period previous to the crisis. And thirdly, exports in real terms are growing more or less the same than the period before the crisis in real terms. So the impact of the oil prices is very important to explain this.
My guess is that if Spain continues to grow at 2% of annual GDP, we will probably have external imbalances, as the case of Turkey, for example. I mean, Spain's economy, that every time that it grows, it has external imbalances. It's been that way for the last 50 years, and it has not changed.
But that's Mihalis' point. The striking thing is that growth performance in the last few years, which is at least well ahead of where most of Europe is, has not resulted in a resumption of large current account deficits. That suggests some role for competitiveness in some sense. Even though the absolute contribution of exports to growth is nil, you would expect it, based on this historical relationship, to be negative. So that suggests some positive. I think it's a logical argument. Whether it's
It is. I mean, in fact, I think we need 10 more years to see if, what's going on, no?
Oh, yeah.
But I'm not sure about it.
I mean, what is the effect of the oil? Have you calculated?
We have not
Like in the
calculated.
case of the US, it's a very significant.
In the case of Spain, it's tremendously significant.
the other
What's
thing
the
is
share of what happens?
current
We
accounts.
basically have around 3% of GDP of
It should be the trade balance for
energy.
the story, because the current, in some of these countries, trade balance, current account balance look very different. And for the story you're telling, the relevant number is the trade balance, not the current account balance. I mean, I know, like for Greece, people say, oh, Greece had, before the euro, they
In
had
this
a balanced
period,
account
though-
balance, but with their trade deficit was huge. They just said,
In this period, there is no. I think they're very well correlated.
you think the
In the
trade
big
balance
90s, there is a
will be
big
together?
break, so a big decrease of the capital transfers from the Eurozone
Yeah.
to the American account. But in this period, it's
They're stable. Okay.
All right. Let's join me in thanking our panelists. We'll head to lunch. And you guys can